Hi, everyone. This is going to be a video addressing a question by Marcia about does Jesus truly teach on remarriage uh, after divorce? Does he say that's prohibited? And this will actually kind of change into the issue is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Matthew, and we'll see why that is in play here. Correct. Is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Matthew correct as reflected in the KJV of Matthew 5:31-32? So, just so you know, before we begin, what that says is, it has been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. And that does match the Hebrew Matthew. What follows does not. But I say unto you that whoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. Many different ways of reading that, but the blue lines, the blue highlights are inconsistent with the Hebrew Matthew, and we'll see that in a minute. So let's take a look. All right, so let's address this issue. Marcia Mallow writes 20 hours ago regarding divorce and remarriage. What about someone who did not know the law and finds themselves divorced and remarried already when they come to believe? What counsel is given scripturally? This is a common occurrence. Everyone uses Paul's words for counsel on this. Does one in that situation become a eunuch? All right, so basically, is one prohibited from being remarried? And so I think she's looking at the King James. So I write back, hi, Marcia. Well, it turns on the verses, the circumstances you find yourself in. I assumed this was about herself, so I might have jumped to conclusions there. But anyway, this is what I wrote back. Clearly, if you were divorced legally, or whoever this person is she's asking about, if that person was divorced legally with a paper to prove it, then Jesus in the original Hebrew Matthew implies you can remarry. For the Hebrew Matthew, the passage at issue, Jesus is saying in Hebrew that a man is not free to remarry, nor his divorced wife, unless the husband delivers a get, a certificate of divorce under the law. So until that's done, there is no true divorce, is what Jesus is saying. And the consequence of that is if you then remarry without having the certificate, either you or your wife that you put away, if you don't give her that bill so she's free to remarry, then the both of you are engaged in adultery, either you getting remarried or she getting remarried. Now, where do we read the Hebrew Matthew? Well, the easiest way to find it is you can look at our webpage. We have volume 3 of Standford RIves' book, The Original Gospel of Matthew. So I tell her, this is in Standford RIves, The Original Gospel of Matthew, volume 1 or 3. I have the right to post all of volume 3 online. Volume 3 is a complete recapitulation of all the studies in volume 1 and 2 to show you all the resources that were relied upon to reconstruct the Hebrew Matthew accurately. So, and I'm going to show you where you can find it. So this is the actual URL if you want to look at it. I'm going to go out there and just show it to you real quick. Okay, so we're right here at where in the original Gospel of Matthew of Standford RIves. We're going to show you how to get to this page in a second. So what it says here, and Jesus said to disciples, it was said also to those of long ago, whoever shall leave his wife and divorce her is to give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you, not only that, everyone that leaves his wife is to give her a divorce certificate, but also he who fails to do so commits adultery, and he who takes her commits adultery. And that means if they remarry. So just divorcing doesn't cause adultery, but the next step is if they try to marry, that will be adultery because they're still married to their first wife. And so that all makes legal sense. And that's why this verse, when you see, that's how lots of times when you see the true meaning and the true words were preserved for centuries, a millennia, more than almost 2,000 years. That's why you can prove this was the original, because when you see the original, it makes sense. While I'm going to show you the current one in Greek does not make sense. Now, I just want to show you how you find this work here. So first of all, let me just scroll up here and you can see what this is a reconstruction using all these various sources here. The color coding tells you where it is. The original Hebrew Matthew was quoted by Jerome, Origen, Justin Martyr, Eusebius, and the Scholia of marginal notes left by scholars on early manuscripts. So this is literally a reference that was accessible to people in prior generations, even into the 800s. And in the Islamic lands, they still had it a couple hundred years after we seem to stop citing it ourselves. There was a recent book by a scholar that the book of Luke is actually a translation of the original gospel of the Hebrew Matthew, because it matches more quotes to the Hebrew Matthew as it was quoted in the early church than even the Greek Matthew corresponds with the Hebrew Matthew. So the Luke had more in common with the Hebrew Matthew, in other words, than the Greek Matthew. So that's so interesting, and that's why I put a lot of emphasis on what Luke is saying is being reliable, because he is obviously translating the Hebrew Matthew, and that's why it's closer. And he's doing it for a court case, though, so it's a little bit different. And then there's the Agrapha of Jesus. There's a whole articles on that. There are actually these random quotes that nobody knows where they're coming from, and the only lost book of the early Testament is that the Hebrew Matthew. It was lost, apparently. When that lost, truly, if you want to know the answer, is Jerome. Jerome translated it from Hebrew into Greek and Hebrew into Latin, and yet it's gone. And he made a big deal about it, and he thought it was. And he said in the actual Latin, it's often mistranslated. It says most people believe it is the original. That's what he said. And so he was endorsing it, and the proof in the pudding is when he does his own commentary on the book of Matthew, he repeatedly refers to the Hebrew Matthew and says, "See, this is how it reads in the Hebrew Matthew," and he would fix things. So, for example, where it says in the prayer, our daily bread in the Our Father, he looked at it in the Hebrew Matthew, and it's actually saying tomorrow's bread. And then when he did more research and digging into the Greek word for what we translated as daily, he found out, you know what, that word actually also means tomorrow in other Greek language. So he actually recommended we would change in the future and translate the word there. Give us tomorrow's bread. Give us today the bread for tomorrow. And that's how it should really read, just to show you how much importance he put on it, how much it enlightened him to do a good and better translation. So anyway, this is what's all reflected here. The Ebonite version of the gospel. Then there's McDaniel did translation. Howard has done a translation. Then there's the Du Telet Matthew. All of these Aramaic Matthews. Every single ancient Hebrew or even Aramaic, which is close to Hebrew, text is considered. And then when you let that reflect and bleed through into the final version, you get what this is here in this book. So this is what you'll see if you go to the original Gospel of Matthew. It's free at our webpage, and now I'm going to show you how to get that real quick. And I have permission to do that, to let you see the incomplete volume 3, which is the reconstructed Matthew, using these techniques and these color codes that you can see where it came from without having citation. And let me show you how you find it. All right, so if you go to the web page, the main web page, let me show you here. Home is the main web page, okay? But then you go to books. You have all these books to look at, and you go down to Original Gospel of Matthew. Click that. Then you can kind of skip through this, and you go to the Final Reconstruction, Volume 3. And I originally put it up in 2012, and then we put it up in 2014. So the latest 2014 edition is here. You click that, and you'll see the Final Reconstruction of the Original Gospel of Matthew. And this gives you variants to consider. And if you want to know what the source is, again, you just use the color coding to figure out where it came from in the first place. Okay, so now we'll go back to the discussion. All right, so back to the letter. So then the letter continues to Marcia. It reads in Matthew 5, verses 31 to 32 of the original Gospel of Matthew by Standford RIves as follows. Verse 31, and Jesus said to his disciples, it was said to those of long ago, whoever shall leave his wife and divorces her is to give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you, not only that everyone that leaves his wife is to give her a divorce certificate, but also he who fails to do so commits adultery, and he who takes her commits adultery. So that's, again, what I was saying earlier, is that's where Jesus is saying, if you don't give your wife a get, neither can you marry without committing adultery, neither can she remarry without committing adultery. You have to give her the get. So she has a documentation that she's legitimately been divorced by you. So I continue. So this is about the certificate and not how the Greek translation misunderstood that it implies about getting remarried after divorce. Please read it, by contrast, in the corrupted Greek version. And so again, the way you can see it's corrupted is when you see the original version and you compare it to this version, you'll see the mistakes or the things that just don't make sense. Let's put it that way. And Jesus usually makes sense, right? So tell me if this makes sense the way it reads in the Greek compared to what I just read to you. It has been said, whoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. Same thing as the original Hebrew. But I say unto you that whoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. So right there, it's like, how does putting away your wife cause her thereby to commit adultery? So without the issue of the get, the marriage divorce certificate, unless you have a divorce certificate, why would any kind of adultery even arise by just putting away your wife? So it's the manner in which you put away your wife necessarily must be the explanation of why there can be some sort of adultery that follows. So if you put your wife away without a get, without the divorce certificate, obviously, if she remarries, she will be committing adultery against her husband. Any sexual relationship thereafter is illicit because you don't have a legal certificate. It's the whole point of Jesus' message, right? And then if you read the last thing in the Greek version, it then says, whosoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. I mean, standing by itself, that would simply say that a woman can never get remarried. And the whole point of the divorce certificate, even in Hebrew law, was that the wife could get remarried because she was legally divorced. So that maybe people might not want to marry a divorced woman. They assume something went wrong in the marriage, but that didn't mean she couldn't get legally remarried. And so that's very important for the woman's rights to move on and have a new relationship and start her life over with somebody else. So anyway, that's why this doesn't make sense in Greek, right? Does not make sense that if you put away your wife, saving for the cause of fornication, this causes her to commit adultery. That doesn't cause her to commit adultery when she gets remarried, right? But it does cause adultery if she doesn't have a divorce certificate. Okay, so and then whoever shall marry her that is divorced commits adultery. So the whole point of the law is gone. The original law of Moses is that this divorce certificate will let the woman move on and get remarried. So it just doesn't make sense that Jesus would flat out just say, once you're married, you can never get divorced and remarried. That would be what he's saying is, sure, maybe can get divorced in verse 31, but don't try to get remarried. So what's the point of getting a divorce certificate, Jesus? It wouldn't make sense. So our Lord makes sense. And the Hebrew Matthew makes sense, but the Greek doesn't make any sense. All right. Continuing to Marcia, you can see verse 31 in the Greek starts correctly about the bill of divorce as the issue, but this soon disappears in the mistranslation corruption in Greek that ends up saying that marrying a divorced person is wrong, which, again, why am I pointing that out? Because the whole point of the passage in the law and the whole point of a divorce certificate is to allow the person, both the man and the woman, to move on and get married to another person. That's the whole point of it. So Jesus would take away the whole point even of the divorce certificate. So it would be inconsistent for him to say in verse 31, in the case of a divorce, you need to use a bill of divorcement. And then what in verse 32 say, if you do even get one, you don't get the right to remarry. It doesn't make sense. It's the whole concept of legal divorcement is to allow you to get remarried. And this would have Jesus contradicting verse 31. It makes him sound like he's inconsistent with himself. So again, obviously the Hebrew Matthew is the correct version. All right. So in conclusion, for Marcia's sake and for anyone else there who's in this similar situation, I've had this question come up before. And so I'm just trying to make sure I completely address this in a public forum. I've done private comments to people in the past, but I thought I'd put it in writing. So yeah, there's a really important resource that sometimes, in order to resolve a very difficult passage that doesn't make sense in the Greek, you got to ask yourself, could the Hebrew Matthew advise us of what to do? And what is the Hebrew Matthew? Just so we know. Well, I mean, you can see in the sources I showed you, there's a numerous sources for it. But the primary text that most people think of when you say Hebrew Matthew is the one that Professor Howard published in 1989 and again in the 1990s, called the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. And what that is, that's the Shem Tov collected around the 1350. There's about 20 different manuscripts of it, so there's some variance. It is what Professor Howard proved conclusively, really, is that its root is an original Hebrew text that you can see the Greek is, you can prove and demonstrate the Greek is a translation of it, because when it makes a mistake, you can see the mistake is in the Greek translation being off by one letter. from the true translation. So that's how you know there was sort of a copying error in Greek, and you can tell the earliest Greek text was translating from a Hebrew text, and yet made a one letter change by accident in Greek, and that's how you get the Greek text. So, and that happened to deal with where it says John the Baptist ate manna in Hebrew, and the word manna, I'm trying to remember which way it is. There's egress and there's egress. So manna in Greek, I think, was egress. But if you make a mistake and you say agris, it then says locust. So now it says in our Greek text, he eats locust. Well, Professor Howard points out that, well, of course it can't be locust. I mean, does anyone eat locust? No, but manna makes a lot more sense anyway, right? And so what's the difference between locust in Greek, agris, and egress? E-G-R-I-S versus A-G-R-I-S. Just a simple single letter. So what was the original word? The original word was manna, and the original translation should have been egress, but somebody down the road saw E-G-R-I-S and they copied it wrong and it put it into A-G-R-I-S. And this must have happened very early because there's not even a variant text we know of that says manna, except in the Hebrew. So the original source of the Greek Hebrew Matthew absolutely was a Hebrew text of Matthew. That's where it started, and that's what the early church said. And all these scholars who claim wisdom that they knew better have been proven foolish over time. Okay, so anyway, I hope that helps everybody. And so always remember that if you see something strange you don't understand, Jesus says, try to go to that web page I provided you. It's on our website. It's under the books. It's under the original Gospel of Matthew. And then go pull up the 2014 edition, and that'll help you. And I use it for sometimes just simply to pray with. And so that to me is the more authentic version of the Hebrew of the Gospel of Matthew. All right, everybody, take care. God bless. Ciao. Bye.